Good morning, everybody. My talk will be in Italian. I hope it's not a problem. First of all, I would like to spend a couple of words to talk about the CMCC Foundation, which studies climate change. So we're not talking just about climate change models, but also the impact assessment, the damage assessment, and in particular the impact on agriculture and different sectors. So this is a multidisciplinary sector that allows to focus on climate change under different points of view. We are a multidisciplinary foundation, and this is the best way to face this problem, which is not just a scientific problem. CMCC is based in different areas of Italy. I work at the headquarters of Caserta, but we also collaborate with different international institutes. And we also have the task to educate people by means of Italian documents. And we inform people about the outcomes of the CMCC community. And today, we talked about the situation. So I would like to invite you to see the recordings. First of all, I would like to talk about climate change. Sometimes it is defined as a future problem. But I would like to start from the perception of the idea that the climate change is already there, and it is quite evident throughout our national territory. This is a chart that comes from a document that was drafted in the past, and it concerns the temperature anomalies over the last 60 years with respect to the annual mean of 13 degrees Celsius in Italy during the 1961-1990 period. We can see that under a statistic point of view, climate change is already there. This chart can be proposed for different cities: Milan, Rome, Naples, Catania, Palermo, Ferrara. These are all the cities where we checked this trend, which was built up with different analyses. And this is a trend that is present everywhere. And what makes the difference is that the temperature trend is always there, but sometimes we don't find the trends for storms. But we find trends on hot nights, tropical nights, very hot stays. So temperature is not just meant as an average temperature, but in this case, we consider extreme temperatures, which are typical of climate changes. I would like to show you also the precipitation trend, because it talks about the complexity of how precipitation changes throughout Italy. It's difficult to understand precipitation trends in Italy as a single country, because in Italy there are different areas. It's difficult to put together the Alps or the south of Italy, which have different precipitation characteristics. So the national scale on precipitation was misleading in terms of climate change. Then there is another consideration to be made. Even if we look at the trends on the extreme events of rain on an hourly rate, we can see that in these blue areas from November to March, in some areas, we can find a significant trend with an increase in the extreme events. And it is interesting to see that none of these points has a decrease in these extreme events. This is a signal that is quite interesting to consider. And let's now talk about the impact. The increase in the rainfall or in the extreme event rates is combined with other events. So even small variations are not managed, cannot be managed easily, but we need adaptation policies. They need to focus on quantities, because we cannot change a territory, we cannot make it resilient at random, but we need to have tools, we need to have measuring tools so that we can work on the resilience. Climate models nowadays play the role of investigating what are the possibilities to change the climate, how the climate will change, and what kind of actions should be implemented. You have already seen this chart. Climate change is a global phenomenon, and I would like to highlight it again, but then impacts are local. So decisions have to be taken locally, and we also need to define instruments allowing us to assess the impact and therefore the risk. So it is particularly important and significant in this moment to consider larger scales, such as the impact scales. As to the impacts on the Mediterranean area, and Italy belongs to this area, I think it is quite frustrating that in 2016 there was a document drafted by the European Agency concerning the impacts that we had to expect in terms of climate change on the Mediterranean area. The vast majority of these impacts have been reconfirmed in this new report by the IPCC on the Mediterranean area. So we had a certain period of time in which we not only had an uncertainty, which is typical of any science, but we consider that impacts were foreseeable, and therefore the adaptation had to start from the know-how that we had in the past. But unfortunately, in Europe, adaptation doesn't always take place. And therefore, there are different risks because of that. Risks, for example, concerning the agricultural production, the risks concerning the lack of water, the risks of frequency products and floods. So we need to work on shorter periods to reduce the impacts. In order to carry out this kind of studies and to assess the impact and to understand some characteristics of the climate change, we can use these climate models or statistics techniques. When we need to manage impacts involving the knowledge of different fields, such as wind, humidity, soil, and other information, we can use dynamic models. If we can represent the complexity of the atmosphere, we can have a more precise overview thanks to these models, to these dynamic models. They are very useful to make assessments. At the moment, within the Codex program, there are different projects, and we are working hard to define convention permitting models with a resolution that is below 4 kilometers. So what do we expect? We expect to improve the accuracy of the daily events, and this makes the difference at local level, because the smaller areas have a shorter action time. So starting from the moment in which we have the flood to when we need to act, then we need to act quickly. And then we can also consider wind events, as we heard in the previous presentation. So we need these kind of models. The work is carried out inside the communities, because it is very important for us to consider and assess uncertainty. I would like to sum up some of the results that we have about climate change in Italy, drawing inspiration from this work that was carried out for the Ministry of Infrastructures this year, which is about the change in the infrastructure in the next years, considering climate change. So we selected, for political reasons, strategic reasons, 2 time windows, 2030 and 2050. And we also decided to focus on 2 scenarios, the RCP 2.6 and the RCP 4.5. Why not on the 8.5? Because at the time, we believed that 8.5 was not representing the reality, also considering the mitigation works that have been carried out over the past years. Then the scenario has changed. So in the new adaptation program, we are considering 8.5 as well, because the economic, social, and political uncertainty is different as compared to what we had before. As to the detection of the average temperature, I hope that the image is clear. We can see the variation that is roughly the same across the whole of Italy, except for the Alps. In the 2.6 and in the 4.5 scenarios, that is the area that warms up the most. That is for 2030. And then for 2050, we've got heating all over Italy. But in this case, the warmest area is the south of Italy, even though in the Alps we have a certain level of uncertainty. So this is an area that is very challenging for those who have to use these kind of models. So we need to work a lot on this, which is very complex. So why did I talk about the temperature? Because the RCP says that in the next few years, we'll have to face an emergency which is due to temperature that will affect the Mediterranean in the next few years, unlike rainfalls. As to the heat index, one of the areas where this is going to change the most is the Alps. And this is visible in our chart, in our table. And this applies to the fires as well. And what is important to consider is that at the moment, the main damages to infrastructures are due to floods, but in the future, the main damages to the infrastructures should be due to heat and fire. And we know that heat is going to increase. At the moment, the temperatures are much higher. As to the extreme events, let's have a look at the storms. Here we use the data from Eurocodex, and we cannot have a clear signal that shows us some trends. So we need to have more local studies to carry out an assessment of this kind of hazards and dangers. We hope that the models that we are developing can give us a clearer information. As to the intense precipitations, and here we check the levels and the information. We can see that on average there is an increase, especially in the center and in the north, and especially at winter time. And then for floodings, we can see that the area that is most affected is the area around the Adriatic Sea and the Tyrrhenian Sea. And we analyzed the data from the tides in order to say that we should have an increase in the level by 80 centimeters. This is another chart coming from a report, and it shows on the left-hand side data concerning Italy. So we can see the difference, the concept of average temperature in Italy. And here we can see the differences in terms of temperature in Italy. But what is important for the society is the different levels of warning. So here there is a massive difference on whether we can reach this target, the target of 1.5. Also considering heat waves, the duration and the frequency. Well, a difference that is lower considers the runoff. But then we need to consider whether it is a runoff that grows by 30% in Italy, because in terms of impact, this is probably a value that we cannot afford. So climate change has to be taken into consideration in a model that is more complex, that considers the whole of Italy. Climate models are not used only to carry out an assessment of the climate change, but they also give us the opportunity to have tools defining adaptations and different solutions. And we're working a lot on that. We are using more detailed models. The information that we get is much more detailed, so that we can better define the risk and the solutions. This is, for example, an experiment that we are doing in the city of Brescia. They decided to replace an area where there is concrete, and that they would like to introduce a green area. The main purpose here is to make people understand that that green area can bring benefits. And this is just to talk about the climate change in a different way, so that it is understandable to everybody. But this measure of adaptation can be hardly implemented because people do not want to give up parking lots. I mean, science is doing a massive work, but if there is no education, if we cannot provide information and training, then our contribution is limited. Because here the problem is the transfer of information. We need to work a lot on that. This is a study that we carried out on 20 European cities within the Copernicus project. We defined how the extreme rainfall events have changed as compared to the past. Because it is important to represent these events on an hourly basis. And how do we do that? We analyze the data on the exposures to rainfalls of the cities. And then we compared the data in 20 European cities. And we showed that these data allow to carry out risk assessments. And therefore it is they are important because we can understand what are the damage curves. We move from the assessment of the rainfall to the assessment of the level of water to the assessment of the damage. This is another study that we carried out in Naples. And we analyzed the problems of the drainage network. And this is important for the network planners. This study has been carried out using Eurocordex data. Out of 12 Eurocordex models, 5 models were proposing stationary data, while all the others, 5 of them showed that data remained still, while the others showed that data were changing. And we did not have any data that showed that there was a reduction in the extreme events. We needed to talk about that in the right way, because if we don't do anything, we're still going through a risk, because the situation will not improve. And in actual facts, it could get even worse. This is the detail I was showing before. We compared the different state-of-the-art analysis. This is an analysis on 2-kilometer areas, but there are different studies as well. And we could represent the variation of the rainfalls on an hourly basis. What is important to consider is the increase in the temperature, as well as the increase in the sea level, especially on the coastal areas. Also, I would like to mention this image to say that adaptation is important, but we also have to say that a cow cannot adapt itself to the increase in the sea level and become a dolphin. There are some limits that we cannot go beyond, that we cannot overcome. The only thing that we can do is to adapt ourselves, even though it is not fully possible. And this is the only way to live in a better society. Thank you.
No, rimane ancora più. Is there any question? Yes, Piero.
Thank you, Paola. So you said that back in 2016, I think it was IPCC that warned us about the impacts in the Mediterranean areas, and despite the notice period, nothing happened, actually. So are the responsibilities like purely political, or what happened?
I don't like this work of the responsibility, because if you ask to the journalists say that the responsibility is of politics. But my understanding of this situation is that everyone, depending from competence, background, has some is involved, is a cause of the problem. Journalists, perhaps, they are continuing to having a wrong storytelling of the climate change, and perhaps this is a problem. Another problem is that perhaps in Italy, I don't know in the other countries, but in Italy our habitude is to work on the emergency. And but now climate change is an emergency. And then, to be honest, also because you have to think that there are many good practices in Italy at regional level, at local level. There are many cities that are working on the adaptation. Then perhaps it's right that the politics are very relevant, but it's also important that people are involved, because as I mentioned, in the city of Brescia, they have the local government defined this adaptation measure, but people want the parking. And then, which is the guilty in this, I don't know.
Thanks. Thank you.